Hello and welcome back to the next video of the Hibernate course. And in this video, we are going to explore the Hibernate persistence context. The Hibernate persistent context is one of the most important concepts to understand if you are working with Hibernate. And even though we haven't been thinking about the persistence context until this point of this course, we have been using it all the time. And to get a little more understanding of this context, because it's very important to understand how the Hibernate persistence context works. Yeah, we will explore that in this video. And let us start with a little thinking. We have been using some methods in this course so far on our entity manager. So we used, for example, the persist method, the find, the merge, and remove method. And we used them to create a new object in the database, for example, the persist method. We used the find method to read stuff from the database. We used merge to update and remove to delete. And you may have been wondering if these methods are used for create, read, update, and delete, why are they not called this way? Why do we use persist instead of create and merge instead of update? Well, this is because these methods that you can see on the left side will result eventually in the operations on the right side, but they are more than that. The persist is not a create method and the merge is not an update method. These methods can result in an update in the database or a create or an insertion in the database, but they are not exactly that, and this is why they are called differently. And to see what they're actually doing, we go back to our very simple application. We go back to our Java backend that has some kind of persistence unit. And so far, we have been thinking about that the application just uses Hibernate to communicate with the database. And while this is true, there's a very important thing in between our Java application and the persistence unit. And this is the persistence context. The persistence context, you can imagine the persistent context like a sort of cache where Hibernate caches objects and also keeps track of the changes of these objects. Now, when we use the persist method on the entity manager, we want to use that for a new entity that is not known by the database and not known by the persistence context until now. So really a completely new object. Imagine you get a new object from an API, yeah, from some client, and this ID and this object is totally new. And these objects that are not known by the persistence context or by the data or by the persistence unit are called transient entities. So transient means not known, if we can say it like that. And to write a um, transient entity to the persistence context, we need to use the persist method. Now, if we want to update a object where we think that it's either has to be known by the persistence context already or by the persistence unit, then we have to use the merge method. And an entity that, yeah, could be known or is known by the persistence context or the persistence unit is called detached entity. So we use the merge method to write a detached entity into the persistence context. So for example, what would happen if we now pass a object that has the ID 1 and we changed some values in this object and we know that um, this object already exists? Well, then what Hibernate could do, for example, if the entity is not already cached in the persistence context, is that it would try to read the entity, it would try to find the entity in the persistence unit, write it into the persistence context, and now merge the incoming entity that you can see on the left side with the entity that is already now in the persistence context. And this is why this method is called merge, because it actually merges two states together. And during the merge, what the Hibernate also can see is what has actually changed in this entity. And this process is called dirty checking. And we will see in the code later what this actually does. And so an entity that is a transient entity that is getting persisted to the context, or a detached entity that's getting merged to the context, or any entity that gets fined from the persistence unit and is written into the persistent context is called persistent or managed. So an entity that is inside the persistent context is persistent or managed. It means the same thing. And last but not least, we can also remove an entity from the persistent context. Okay, so this is what these four methods do. And the thing to keep in mind now is that these things are only in the persistence context, not on the persistence unit. And what now will happen is that during a transaction, so if we execute these methods, the writing and the updating in the persistence context, during a transaction, Hibernate will keep track of the changes of these entities that are in the persistent or managed state and apply these changes at the end of the transaction to the persistence unit. So if we write a new entity, we get the transient entity and persist it to the context. This will eventually, at the end of the transaction, result in a create method, in an insertion into the persistence unit. If we merge a detached entity, this will eventually result at the end of the transaction in an update. If we remove an entity from the persistence context, this will eventually end up in a delete statement. And this is what the persistence context does. And this has some interesting results. It results in some interesting situations when we code. And I will just show you that now in IntelliJ. Okay, so here we are back in IntelliJ. And just to show you quickly where we left off, this is our customer CRUD controller where we have um, our customer entity, and this is our customer entity, and it's just a CRUD controller where we create, read, update, and delete the customer from the database. And just as we have seen before, we are using the persist method for the creation and the merge method for the update and remove for delete. Now, by what we've just seen, we already know that persist is not a create and update and merge is not an update, but these are methods that manage our entities on our persistence context. And to show you which real impact these difference has on our application, I just started the server and I will show you some examples. So for example, if we create our customer on our database by just sending the customer via endpoint and then directly persist it, we can see that this will result in a insertion statement. It will insert the driving license and the customer to our database. And we can see that our customer, our new customer, and the new driving license got created. Now, what would happen if we did the following? We use the persist method, and now after we persisted our customer, we could do customer dot set email and then we just write test at example.com. And if this method, if this persist method was a create method, then this should not have any impact on our database anymore, because we created the entity manager, we created the customer, and then we set the email. And well, the result is something else. As we can see, we don't pass any email. We set the email after we call the persist method, and still on our database, we can see that the email got applied to our customer. And this is because of what we just said. This thing only writes stuff into the persistence context. It persists the customer to the persistence context. Now after this customer entity is managed, becomes a managed entity in the persistence context. We can still work on this entity. We can do a lot of changes here. And only when the transaction ends, then Hibernate will propagate these changes to the persistence unit. And this is very important to understand, because if we think that this is the create, and then we start doing stuff on our entity afterwards, this will get persisted to the database. And we need to be careful about that. Now, let's continue with the merge. So what would happen if we do the same thing with merge? We get our customer, we say customer.email, and then we return our customer. Well, maybe you would expect the exact same thing to happen now. But let's see if this is actually the case. So we are going to go to our request. We are going to create our customer. Now we are going to update our customer with the ID 3. This is the customer we just got created. We have no email inside our customer, and we do the update. And what we can see is that there's still no email. So the change that we set over here was not applied. This is strange, right? Because we just basically did the same thing like over here. Well, the reason for that is that the merge method gives us or returns the merged customer. So let's make a new variable. Let's call this thing merged customer. The object that we pass to the method is not going to get managed. What is managed is the entity that comes back. And now we can restart the server. And we can again create our customer. We can update our customer. And now we can see that the email is here. So this is a difference that you also need to consider. If we use the merge method, it will give us back a new entity that is managed. If we use the persist method, the same object reference is going to get managed. Now, what actually happens in an update? Let us have a look and let us delete the log. Just call this method, this endpoint again, and see what Hibernate does. So as we can see, Hibernate selected first the customer from the database and then did nothing. We don't see any update here. And this is because nothing changed in our customer now. We got a customer, we assigned the same email like before, so nothing got updated. If we now, let's say, change the date of birth to any value, and we will call this again, we will see something else. We can now see that it selected the customer again and actually updated the customer because it could detect a change in the entity. And this is the so-called dirty checking. And we can see that it only updates the customer entity. It does not update, okay, it has no driving license now, so it won't update the driving license. But we can also do the following. We can add a driving license. Let's first add ID 0 and license number LN2. Now post this. So we can see that now our customer got created. We can see that Hibernate inserted a new driving license and updated the customer because now it has to set a driving license ID. So this was the update. And now we could see that the ID is 2. So we actually need to pass a valid object to this. So the ID is now 2. This is a number. And we won't change anything now. We will just run this again. We can see select statement, but no update statement, only select statements. And if we now change the number of the driving license, we can see that it selects everything again and then only updates the driving license and not the customer. And this is the so-called dirty checking. Hibernate checks which entities have actually changed and then applies these changes to the database. So even if we call merge on the customer does not get updated if nothing in the customer entity changes. In this case, only something in the driving license changed. The driving license is connected with the customer with the cascading type, and therefore it will get updated. Okay, the last thing that I want to show you is now our car assignment controller. Because what do we do here? We get a car ID and we get a customer ID, and we assign this car to the customer. We find the customer and we find the car, and then we modify these two entities, and at the end we call the merge method. But what does happen if we use the find method? Just like we have seen before, with the find method, the entity manager will read these entities, or will write these entities to the persistence context. And we change stuff in these entities. And we are in a transaction. So Hibernate will keep track of these changes. Do we need the merge at the end? No, we don't need the merge. We used the merge because we thought this is our update and we have to explicitly call this update. But this is not true. We can just delete this as well. And then we can just call this method and we'll see that it will still work. So I will just restart the server, go back to the HTTP client, and we'll call the method, the assignment method. Where is it? Over here. And we want to assign a car to the customer 1. We want to add the car with the ID 1. So to just make things clear, we can see that the car has no customer ID for now. We call the method and we can see that now on the database the ID got assigned just by keeping track of these changes and using a transaction. And this is the persistence context. If you have any questions on the persistence context, if you have any suggestions for the video, I would highly appreciate a comment below this video. And if you have learned something and if you liked the video, I would also really appreciate a like on this video. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.